Wang Zhihuan crossing the border. The yellow river merges into white clouds far away. A small deserted town sits high at the mountain top. That Tartar flute should not be playing the willow tree lament. Spring breezes never blow this way through Jade Gate Pass. So we continue with the heptasyllabic Juefu quatrains, and here we have a poem by Wang Zhihuan. This poet was already represented in this anthology by another piece, and it was also a quatrain, if I remember well. I think it was a pentasyllabic quatrain at Heron Lodge, which was basically your typical poem describing the views from one of those low pavilions that so graced the Chinese landscape. The low was it's basically not too tall a building in spite of the translation pavilion. It was basically a two-story building, and most Chinese architecture, except for pagodas, was pretty horizontal. But there were pleasure quarters where the second floor was generally devoted for sightseeing and quaffing and drinking and reciting poetry. So this is his second poem, as I said, and Wang Zhihuan, well, he is not a particularly famous poet. Only 6 of his compositions survive, which means that with 2 poems in this anthology, a third of his complete poetic output is included in the collection. And we already read his biography. He's basically a high town poet, and he was a contemporary of some more famous figures. For example, who did he know? I think some of the typical border style poets, like he was a friend of Gao Shi, and he was also acquainted with Wang Chanling. Never passed the examinations, but managed to obtain minor posts thanks to aristocratic privilege. So let's go back to this poem. Like some of the poems we've been reading, including the previous one by Wang Chanling, this poem by Wang Zhihuan is a frontier poem. So it dwells in all of the conventional tropes, ideas of this type of poetry that we've explored quite in detail in this anthology. That is to say, frontier poems are generally focused on the soldiers, on the misfortunes of said soldiers fighting a war in the remote frontiers and usually dying and not returning. And the alien, exotic, and harsh landscape of the steppes is represented. Generally, these poems are set in the northwest, in the area that during the Han times was ruled by the Xiongnu. The barbarian territories of the northwest. And they're always sad, melancholy poems. Very seldom do they have an epic tone of exultation at Chinese martial prowess in the frontiers. They're generally complaints about the tough life here, the exotic and negative exoticity of the landscape, needless death. Remember, Chinese society in its imperial period is for the most part a very civil society which subordinates martial values and virtues as something brutish and uncivilized, and not to be praised, at least not as much as civil virtues. So that's what we can say in general about this poem. This poem, Crossing the Border, is actually one of a pair of poems of Wang Zhihuan. The 2 have been preserved. This is Crossing the Border number 1. The other, Crossing the Border number 2, we're not going to read it, but it basically depicts an anecdote in which the Shanyu, the military emperor, ruler of the barbarians, it's depicting a historical event, I think, comes to China, to a frontier post, to negotiate with the Chinese the tribute that they are going to pay him to avoid his campaigns and expeditions against the Chinese. But the poem, it's a quatrain also. The poem concludes in the second quatrain that, now that the martial emperor is sitting on the throne, which would have been Han Wudi in Han times, or perhaps another of the martial emperors of the Tang dynasty is meant to be reflected here. The idea is now that there is this martial ruler in China, the barbarian chief has to go back with the tail between his legs and without having satisfied his ambitions. So the second one actually is rather more martial and more conventional, as military poems of all cultures would go. This first one is more intrinsically Chinese. So topics of the poem, we've already mentioned them. They're the typical ones of classical Chinese frontier poetry. Tough life at the frontier, the feeling of loneliness, the exotic alien landscape, the un-Chinese harsh weather and climate. So let's take a look at the poem quatrain, this quatrain couplet by couplet as we usually do, and comment on any characteristics. First couplet. The yellow river merges into white clouds far away. A small deserted town sits high at the mountain top. So as usual, the first couplet in a quatrain is rather descriptive and objectivist. So we know from the title that we're crossing the border, so we're somewhere in the limits of Chinese sovereignty. Generally, these poems are set in the north, northwest. And we get the indications, if not of time, very definitely of place. And we get a view of the landscape that is quite pictorial. The first line shows us the Yellow River. The Yellow River is a quintessentially Chinese river, but in its middle course especially, it makes like a big bend into the north, into Mongolia, into the Ordos Desert. And those regions, especially those beyond the Ordos Desert, were generally, during many centuries, outside the pale of Chinese rule, or at least in the frontier. So I imagine this poem is set, I think I read somewhere in Liangzhou, one of the northern provinces. We might imagine that the poetic persona is looking out at the Yellow River, probably in the direction of its upper course and therefore of the lands where the barbarians roam. It's a huge river, one of the longest rivers in the world, so of course the poetic gaze looks at the Yellow River, and so far away does it go that it seems, looking towards the remote west or north, that it merges into the white clouds. So there's this majestic element of the landscape, the barbarian landscape, which is the steppe crossed by the river, but it's the steppe, would have been perceived as a rather indistinct and uniform sort of space, monotonously repetitive and equal, without cities and clear landmarks by the Chinese. So the Yellow River is, going on. It seems in an infinitely long distance and merging with the clouds. And this length of distance, also connects very easily with frontier poetry because, the same place from which the poetic persona is talking is also an infinite distance from China's heartland. So it's already connoting this far away, really far away positioning of the poetic persona and the scene. And the second line becomes a little bit more concrete. So in the first we have the river going on to infinity, merging with the clouds. In the second line we have a landmark. A small deserted town sits high at the mountain top. So there are mountains here, and against this background of nature, there is an element of culture. As a small deserted town, this poem interprets it as a small deserted town. Other translations describe it as a fortress, and instead of deserted, they use a word, they translate it with the meaning of lonely, solitary. Anyway, whether it is an abandoned town or whether it is a fortress that is all alone by itself, this town fortress, a fleeting symbol of human presence and of Chinese civilization in the wastelands, is there alone in the mountains for all to see, and probably in a slightly precarious situation because of its loneliness and therefore its exposure to attack and siege. But at the same time, it acts as a last handle for the Chinese civilization in this exotic and barren landscape. And if it is interpreted as a fortress, well, it denotes the fact that here at the frontier you don't have splendid cities like in China. You just have military fortresses for confronting the incursions of the barbarians. Let's move on to the second couplet. So the second couplet, again, as usual, moves into a more subjective element and focuses in. It starts with a song, and a song that is heard by the poetic persona, and ends with a rhetorical question about a lack of feeling. So it gets more immediately sensory. The first couplet is visual. The second couplet plays on other senses, basically the senses of sound and touch. So it says, that Tartar flute should not be playing the willow tree lament. Spring breezes never blow this way through Jade Gate Pass. So there's a Tartar flute. So I think it's a Chiang flute in the original, which is an instrument used by barbarians. The Chiang were a tribe generally in the extreme northwestern fringes of Chinese rule. So a Tartar flute is probably heard by the poetic persona, and it's playing a Chinese tune. It's playing the Willow Tree Lament, which I don't know specifically of, but probably it's a joyful or a ballad, a typical song about separation of lovers or friends. Next to a willow tree, which, as we mentioned in many previous poems, willow trees are symbols, become very clear very early on, symbols of separation, of the separation of friends and lovers, and of early spring. So weirdly, in this exotic alien landscape, an alien flute, a Tartar flute, is playing a Chinese song, the Willow Tree Lament. This surprises the poetic persona, and he continues, concluding that there's one other reason why hearing this song is out of place here. First, it's out of place because a barbarian is playing it in a barbarian flute. But there's another reason why this song doesn't fit here. Spring breezes never blow this way through Jade Gate Pass. This is the barbarian land, so that Willow Tree Lament piece of music, which would be about spring breezes blowing, makes no sense here. In the steppe, there isn't spring as it is understood in China. There is no spring weather or climate. And so this sort of music makes no sense in this alien landscape. The spring breezes never blow this way through the Jade Gate Pass. Yumen, the Jade Gate Pass, was a mountain pass that led in the northwest of China to the areas controlled by the barbarians. There's a symbolic or a metaphoric use also that can be applied to this spring breeze. So we might imagine that the poet is talking of a genuine spring breeze in this alien exotic landscape with exotic weather, but spring breeze might also it might also connote the emperor's benevolence and his thoughts, or the thoughts and feelings of love of all the other relatives of these soldiers. And those feelings of love and appreciation, they're too far away from this God-forsaken land and the frontier, and they don't reach those who have to be here fighting and occasionally listening to the song of the Tartar flutes.